So, okay, I got a couple of questions for you on that. So let's go back to this Starry Night idea. So I want to tell you a story. I was talking to my wife today about the fact that I was going to talk to you because she's been following your meditation course. But at the same time that she's done, she had a medical death sentence 2 years ago.
Yeah.
Fundamentally.
Yeah.
Okay, so she's been through a variety of forms of hell and has come out the other side and has changed in consequence of that. And one of the things she started doing, as well as doing your meditation course, was using the rosary. So I asked her today, she's also been talking to Jonathan Pageau, who's an extraordinarily interesting religious thinker who carves icons. He's a former French Canadian, young guy. He's very, very deep person in my estimation. In any case, she's been praying the rosary. And I said, okay, so, well, you do that and you listen to Sam's meditations. And so how does that work? And she said, well, I do the rosary first. I said, well, why do you do that? And what do you do? And how do you see them related? And she said, well, with the rosary, so she's concentrating on Mary. And she said, Mary's as a conduit to Christ. And I'll explain what she meant by that in a sec. But she said, well, first it's a practice. Okay, so she does it every day. So it's an embodied practice, right? So she says the words and she moves these beads. And so she's moving her hands. And it's divided into 5 sections. And so when her attention wanders from prayer, it's brought back because there's 5 sections. Right. So you imagine you have this tendency to wander off into the default network, but by manipulating something with your hands, it ties you to the present moment.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's a meditative practice that's more embodied than just sitting still, say, and she finds that useful. And while she says the words, well, we've talked a lot about what these words mean, and so in reference to the Starry Night, for example, there's this series of Renaissance paintings which are quite magnificent that show an image of Mary with 12 stars around her head, and with her foot on a serpent. And that's an allusion to the Garden of Eden because, Eve crushes the serpent beneath her foot. And this is relevant to your discussion and our discussion earlier about the deepest of all evils, right? Because that's a concern of yours. It's been a concern of mine. What's the darkest possible place? Well, that snake in those paintings represents that. And that's why in Christianity, the snake, which is a predator, is associated with Satan, right? As what would you say, the emissary of evil or malevolent, something like that. And so because Mary has her head in the stars, she can have her foot on the serpent. And that's part of that meditation. And well, she does that before she listens to your meditation. But that's where I see the psychological link, let's say, because you want to put your psyche in the highest possible place, whatever that is. And we don't know what it is exactly, but it's something like what happens when you look up at the night sky. It's something like that. And if you do that, that means that your foot is simultaneously on that serpent.
Yeah, no, I mean, I don't have any, first of all, it's wonderful that she's using the app and getting some benefit from it. I love that. And the juxtaposition of doing the rosary with doing, what I'm recommending in the app is not as odd as you might think it is in my view. I mean, I have, there's so much there's so much resonance between what I think is true and the kinds of things Jesus said, right? My issue with organized religion, every organized religion, is just that clearly what we're really talking about are deeper universal truths about the nature of mind, right? Whether we limit it to human minds or just mind itself, consciousness itself. And so there's no culture, there's no religion, there's no provincial cult that has the full story. And the burden on us in every present generation, but certainly now in the 21st century, where there are all the barriers to
universalization?
All the barriers to getting information and translating from other languages, all of that's broken down. We have access to everyone's ideas, right? There have been 100 billion people, and a bunch of them have had good ideas, a bunch of them have had bad ideas, and we have access to thousands of years of human conversation. And so my only argument,
sort out what those ideas were.
My only argument is that we should only care about using the best ideas, and we no longer have the right to any deep, serious sectarianism. Right now, that's not to say that you can't be especially taken with Jesus and the tradition that has grown up around him, and you're kind of bored with Socrates, and so you don't spend as much time with him, and that's all fine. But the problem I've had traditionally with organized religion is religion historically is the only corner of culture where people begin saying to themselves and to their children, we're playing a totally different game over here. This is not a matter of just ideas and human beings and human conversations and ordinary books. No, these books were written by God or inspired by God, and they can't be edited. And
I think it seems to me that the danger in that, I'm not disagreeing with you, but it seems to me the danger in that is that it actually minimizes the problem of atrocity that's associated with sectarianism, because, and perhaps you're not.
I'll agree with you. You can heap as many atrocities as you want on that side of the balance, and I will agree with you.
Well, okay, so this is what I'm pointing to, though, because we were having a discussion in some ways about sacred things, and then we're talking about the issue of religion, and so there's a couple of things I want to say about that. Dostoevsky had it right to some degree in The Grand Inquisitor, because do you remember that story, The Grand Inquisitor?
Yeah,
okay.
I mean, it's been many several decades since I actually read the book, but yeah.
Well, the remarkable thing about that story is Christ comes back to earth, and he does some miracles, and it's the church himself that puts him in jail, and then the head of the church comes to the jail and says, what the hell are you doing back here? The last thing we need is you. We've got everything sorted out. We know what's going on. It's like, we're going to put you to death tomorrow. And then Christ kisses him on the lips, and the Grand Inquisitor turns white. And then when he leaves, the Grand Inquisitor, he leaves the door open. And that's so brilliant. And, Dostoevsky was writing at the same time as Nietzsche and had quite an influence on Nietzsche, as it turned out. But because Dostoevsky was writing fiction, he could go places that Dostoevsky couldn't go as a philosopher. And one of the things he was trying to point out was that despite the proclivity to totalitarianism that you can lay at the feet of sectarian religion, the door's left open. And, all of us have to come to terms with the fact that our institutions, religious and otherwise, tend to ossify into these totalitarian structures that are analogous socially, I think, in some ways to the default network that you just described. They're trying to point to something beyond that, but they degenerate and ossify, and then but then we have to go underneath that too if we're going to get our criticisms right, because as terrified as it's reasonable to be about religious sectarianism and totalitarianism, it's also necessary to remember that chimpanzees go on raiding parties and kill the neighboring tribe, so to speak, and they're not motivated by religious concerns. And so to put that at the feet of religion, even implicitly, I think I understand why that's an impulse, but it doesn't face the problem deeply enough. And it also obscures a potential solution, I think, because it tends to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And I know you're trying to regain the baby.
No, I'm trying to save the baby.
Yes.
No, I love that baby. I mean, for me, the crucial variables that make religion itself so problematic are, one, the religions, and this is true of the Abrahamic ones in particular, the religions that are focused on a text, right, that can't be edited. Now, religious moderates and religious liberals will disagree with me, and they'll say that the whole tradition is a matter of reinterpreting and grappling with the contradictions and that's all a very rich discourse and blah blah blah. But the real problem is the books themselves betray their merely human origin on almost every page. There's just it's true of the plays of Shakespeare. It's true of the Iliad and the Odyssey. It's true of Virgil. It's true of Dostoevsky, and it's true of the Bible, right? In all its parts, right? So if you just imagine how good a book could be, if it were truly written or dictated by an omniscient being. I mean, it's trivially easy to imagine that these would be so much better than they in fact are.
It's really not that easy to translate the sorts of experiences that you're pointing to into words.
I know. Right? No, but you can do it better and worse.
Okay. Let's talk about that for a minute. Better and worse, because that's really and I want to tie this back to your comments about navigation earlier. Mm-hmm. So, we do have, and this is perhaps an issue of definition, getting the definition straight again here. We do have the sense that some texts are deeper than others. And I don't think it's reasonable to disagree about that. You can read a shallow story, you think, well, that was shallow. And you can read a deep story and you think that was deep, but you don't know exactly what you mean by shallow or deep. So let me just add one footnote here, which is somewhat confounding. It goes to what we were just saying about psychedelics. It's possible for you to be bringing the depth to a text or to a circumstance or to a puddle in a parking lot that isn't necessarally there, right? So this is where it gets confusing. The postmodern quandary.
Yeah,
yes, exactly.
I mean, literally, if you're going to connect all the dots, you can. I mean, this is something I did in the End of Faith as a parlor trick, just because I wanted to prove this point. Is that I literally walked into a bookstore and went to the cookbook aisle of the bookstore and randomly chose a cookbook and opened it up at random and just wrote down the recipe. And then created a mystical text on the basis of that recipe. I mean, I just showed that this recipe, which it was for some Hawaiian cookbook, was like wok-seared fish and shrimp cakes or something. And I took the ingredients in that recipe and wove a completely confabulatory, mystical text out of those ingredients. Now, that was something I was bringing to the text. There was no author creating that document.
That's clearly a problem. And look, when I made my crack about
people can always do that, right? So it's very hard to keep score here and to be rigorous. All we can do is again and again have this experience of you say something that on your own side purports to be meaningful and intends to be meaningful, and you're trying to convey something, and then I and other people seem to grasp what you're communicating, and we have this intersubjective convergence, which is increasingly satisfying. And yes, so I mean, but I do take your point that Dostoevsky was writing. The Brothers Karamazov is a deeply interesting, meaningful document.
Okay, so let's take that. Let's take that argument apart, because you put your finger on the postmodern quandary, right? Because the postmodernists, in some sense, the reason that they ran into trouble with assuming, they criticized the notion that there was a canonical interpretation of a text because there's so many subjective interpretations of any text. In fact, there's a near infinite number of potential subjective interpretations of any text, just like there's almost an infinite number of places you could be looking right now. And so it's a huge, deep problem. So, and when you say that you can project something onto the text that in some sense isn't there, that's also an extremely deep problem. And these problems are deep enough, the fact of multiple interpretations of a single reality is so pervasive that it stopped AI researchers. It's the thing that stopped AI researchers from being able to build functional robots. Like it's a killer problem.
Yeah, it's a frame problem.
So that's the frame problem. Okay, so let's agree that exists. But we should also agree, and partly I think by the merits of your own argument, that we do have a reliable subjective intuition that texts differ in depth.
Yeah.
And that means something. So I'm going to propose what it means, and you tell me what you think about this, okay?
Sure.
So one of the ways that we specify where to look at is by looking at what we deem to be important. And so here's a way of conceptualizing that. And it sort of maps onto the idea of the fovea extending outward to less high-resolution consciousness. So I write a sentence because I want to write a paragraph. I write a paragraph because I want to sequence paragraphs into a book, a chapter. I write chapters to sequence them into a book. I write a book because I want to be a practicing scientist. I want to be a practicing scientist because I'm a good citizen. I want to be a good citizen hypothetically because I want to be a good person. And maybe I want to be a good person to avoid the hell that you described. Okay, so those are nested value structures. And we see the world through that structure simultaneously. The whole thing is there. And if one part of it collapses, we make reference to the part that contains it. That's how we don't crash like a computer. Now, the navigation that you described, these nested structures, they're navigation maps as far as I can tell. Now, okay, so here's the depth issue. Some maps have more other maps dependent on them than other maps do. Okay, so if I go into your map structure, some of that's even propositionalized, and I mess about with the deeper axiomatic propositions upon which many other propositions rest, then that's going to disturb you fundamentally. And that's part of that experience of depth. And look, you get much more, if you're married and you love your wife, you're much more upset if she divorces you than if you have an argument about who should do the dishes. Well, why? Well, because the stability of your marriage is a precondition for all sorts of other ways that you perceive the world. And if that's violated, well, that's traumatic.
Yeah.
So and the reason I'm trying to get this clear with you is because you think clearly about these things, but also because it allows for clarification of language in some sense. So we could say that as you go deeper into that nested structure, what you approach becomes more and more sacred. By definition, I'm trying to define it experientially. Because so let's say you're transformed at a fundamental level. That means something shifts way down deep. And that's how you feel it, even in an embodied sense. And what we've defined as human beings, as religious, as far as I can tell, or as sacred, is our attempt to define the landscape that is characterized by those deepest structures of maps. Now, what you're talking about, I think, is outside the map system altogether in some sense. It's the container for all of it.
Yeah, it is in some sense because... or it's orthogonal to it. I mean, it penetrates it at every point, but it's not reducible to it. And I mean, that's why it's so consequential. So, for instance, I think you can. Accepting your picture of nested maps and depth and all of that. I agree with all of that. And maps can be more or less useful and more or less in register with the reality they're purporting to describe, right? So you can have faulty maps, and in science we really try to get an accurate map, and we have
a high resolution map.
Yeah, and we have a language game, which is when it's working, is optimized to, as Richard Feynman famously said, not fooling ourselves, right? I mean, that's like the master value of not fooling yourself. Whereas I would argue in religious discourse, not fooling yourself is not a master value. And in fact, so much of what goes by the name of religious faith. Okay,
but let me put press on terminology then, because you talk about the sacred.
Right.
And you accept that, and you also see it as revivifying and crucial to the prevention of suffering.
Yeah.
But you juxtapose that against religion. And so what's the difference as far as you're concerned between what's sacred and what's religious?
Good question. Well, so maybe the best way to get at it is by reference to a principle, which is I think anything that's true, right? And this is true scientifically, descriptively, but it's true spiritually, and it's true with respect to anything we would call sacred. Anything that's true, anything that's real, is discoverable now, right? It's like a literal, like if we lost everything, if we lost all the books, if we lost all the tools, if we lost everything, and we just found ourselves having to reboot not only civilization but human cognition, everything that is real is discoverable from that starting point. Even if you're starting at zero again. Now we would talk about it differently. We would have we would have memories of what some of us would have memories of all that we'd lost, and that would anchor us to certain expectations. But the point is, what is true? What is real? What is the real opportunity for a direct, self-transcending engagement with reality? Right? What is the real opportunity for overcoming suffering?
Let me take exception to that in one manner. I see what you mean. I understand what you mean. I believe. But here's a potential problem with that. So,
first, I'm not saying. Let me just close the door to a possible misunderstanding. I'm not saying that we shouldn't stand on the shoulders of giants, and I'm not saying tradition is useless. In fact, I would probably agree with you that we should be fairly conservative in how we overthrow our traditions. I mean, so I'm not arguing that we should just be radical iconoclasts we should tear everything down to the studs and start again. That's not what I'm advocating.
Okay, well, what's the difference in your vision then between the tradition that you would be conservative about and religion? I'm not trying to corner you. I'm just trying to see how you're making the distinction conceptually.
It comes down to very specific claims that I think are clearly false, and which many of our religions advertise as not only important but indispensable for their projects. So take Islam as a specific example. Islam, mainstream Islam, not just Al-Qaeda style Islam, just any Islam that really is worthy of the name in the year 2021, is founded on the claim that the Quran is the literal word of God. It is not to be.
The question is, what does literal mean?
Yeah, but in the minds of most Muslims, most of the time, it means that these stanzas were dictated to Muhammad in his cave by the archangel Gabriel, and he was commanded to recite, and he recited them. And what we have here is, in truth, the claim, the Orthodox claim is even more stringent than the seemingly analogous, fundamentalist, Christian claim about the Bible. It's not just that the text itself is verbatim what God said. It's that the document itself is, in fact, like every instantiation of the physical document is itself the Word of God. It's like there's sort of a double layer of sacredness to it.
Well, it
cannot be edited.
Is the problem that claim, or is it the problem that the people who purport to understand it claim to be 100% right?
Well, no. But the problem is that given that claim, and given the actual contents of the book, what you have is an endless source of divisiveness and conflict. Like, if you dignify that claim, you say, okay, this is the most important series of utterances ever expressed on earth. This is it. Let's find out what the creator of the universe wants us to know. What he wants us to know, above all else, is that, one, we should hate and fear and despise and resist and never befriend unbelievers. Right? That message comes through on virtually every page. And a hell has been prepared for these unbelievers, where their skins will be endlessly burned off of them and replenished so that they can be tortured anew, right?
Do you think there's any relationship between that claim and your observation that failure to take refuge in the sacred as you've laid it out dooms you to possession by the default network and puts you into that hell?
Yes. Okay. So it is possible to give a very enlightened reading of this text, or really any text, that allows you to step out of its divisive and toxic implications. So I would support that kind of reading. You know, if we were joined in this conversation by Muslim scholars who said, no, don't you understand? Jordan's spiritual interpretation of this admonishment is precisely what God intended. He intended it to be an engine not of hate and division and sectarian tribalism. He intended it to be a device that would allow you to recognize the emotional and cognitive implications of being caught by dualism, say, right? Like really, you know, et cetera, et cetera. You go as far as you want in that direction. That'd be great. The problem is the book itself gives no indication that your interpretation is the right one. In fact, it gives every indication that it's not, and that
I'm going to
it's
be
heterodox.
Speaking with a sequence of Muslim scholars.
Okay, good luck.
So
I wish you good luck there. Yeah.
Well, I'm praying for good luck because it's a conversation that absolutely needs to be had.
Yeah,
clearly.
no, I would agree.
Sam, I would love to keep...
So I would just to close, finally close this chapter, I would just say that it's not that what you're doing with the book isn't possible. My concern is that these books tend to make that very difficult, and there are other more plausible and easier interpretations that require less hermeneutics, less cognitive bandwidth, less principles of charity, and less cosmopolitanism, and so therefore it's no accident that you wind up with something like the Islamic State if you take the Quran very, very seriously, and that's what worries me as we live in this world where it's increasingly easy for small numbers of people to screw up the whole project for millions of us, you know, as technology, you know, leverages the consequence of
that's why
tribalism.
I've been focusing on development of the individual, you know, because it is increasingly possible for individuals to do that. So we have to stop doing it.
Yes. Yeah.
So,
no, I'm with you there.